Hello everyone and welcome to another video on our own devices. I'm Jean Messier and today we're having a look at yet another vintage document copying system. This is a Spirit Duplicator, also known as a Ditto or Banda machine after two of the most popular brands. Now these were used contemporaneously with and are often confused for mimeographs like the Gestetner cyclostyle that we had a look at in a previous video, but are in fact a distinct technology. So whereas in a mimeograph, ordinary printer's ink is forced through a stencil wrapped around a drum onto the copied page, in a Spirit Duplicator, the ink takes the form of a special dye-bearing wax applied to a paper master sheet, which is then wrapped around the drum. Now, when paper is fed into the machine, it is moistened with a solvent and then pressed up against the master sheet, and this causes some of the dye in the wax to be transferred to the sheet, producing a copy. Now, the Spirit Duplicator was patented in 1923 by American inventor Wilhelm Ritzerfeld, and he founded the Ditto Corporation in Chicago to manufacture and sell his invention. Now, the brand name Ditto soon became a genericized trademark and indeed a verb, with the expression to ditto becoming synonymous with running off copies on a Spirit Duplicator. Similarly, the Banda brand, produced by Associated Automation of London, became the generic term for Spirit Duplicators in the UK and Australia. Now, while I've read a few sources claiming that these machines were responsible for the entry of the word ditto, meaning likewise, into the English language, in fact, this word is significantly older, dating back at least as far as the 17th century. And it started out as a Venetian Italian word derived from the Latin dicere or dictum, to speak. And this is also the root of dictate. So now you know. Right, so let's have a closer look at this machine and how it works. So this is a Rex Rotary R11. This is manufactured by Zeuthen and Aagaard of Copenhagen, Denmark, and imported by the Bøhn Duplicator Company, or BDC, of New York City, with this particular unit being sold by George L. Smith Typewriters of Newport News, Virginia. Now, there's no manufacturing date stamped anywhere on this machine, nor any list of serial numbers that I could find anywhere, but from the general aesthetic and design of this machine, I think it's safe to assume that this was made sometime in the 1950s or early 1960s. And indeed, this checks out because BDC was bought out by BBM Photocopier in 1961, so this can't be any older than that. Right, so a couple of major features on the outside of the machine to point out. We have a receiving tray that folds out in the front. We have a fold-out loading tray for the paper in the rear. We have a lid on the top, which helpfully has the instructions written on the inside. We have our operating crank handle and two control knobs. So to run off copies on this machine, you first had to create a master sheet, which required the use of special transfer paper, which we already looked at briefly in my previous video on the hectograph. So this consists of a sheet of plastic with a thin layer of wax impregnated with a dye, in this case aniline purple or mauvine, and this was the most common color for these sheets because it provided the highest contrast, though other colors were available, including red, green, blue, yellow, brown, and black. And this worked exactly like carbon paper, only in reverse. So if you wrote or typed onto the front of the sheet, it would cause the wax to be transferred onto the back of the master in reverse. So let's just write, this is test. And you can see that text transferred onto the back of the sheet as a mirror image. So one of the big advantages of Spirit Duplicators over mimeographs is that they more easily handled multicolored documents. So whereas in a mimeograph, you often had to swap out the entire drum and stencil and ink to do each color pass, and you had to pass each piece of paper through the machine multiple times, with a Spirit Duplicator, you could transfer different colored waxes onto the same master sheet, and then you only had to pass the sheets through once and you would get all the colors. And for this reason, they were very popular with cartoonists. Now, if you happen to make a mistake while drawing or typing on the master sheet, it was fairly easy to correct. So first, you would scrape off the wax using a special correction blade, and then you would remove the excess using a soft rubber kneadable eraser. And finally, you would cover over any remaining dye with a special correction pencil, and this would prevent the dye beneath from seeping through onto the page. And then you would cut out a little piece of the wax paper, put it in behind, retype the correct character or redraw the correct line, and then move on with creating the rest of the document. Now, once you had your master sheet ready, you then loaded it into the machine by turning the crank counterclockwise until these followers on the sides of the drum come up against these cams, and this forces open this spring-loaded clamp. You then insert the master sheet face down and turn the handle clockwise to close the clamp and feed the sheet into the machine. And you actually didn't have to secure the other side of the master. This actually just rotated through with one end flopping around. But there is a system of rubber rollers on the inside to ensure close contact between the master sheet and the copy sheets going through the machine. Right, so the next step in the process is to open up the top and fill up the solvent system. So as I mentioned at the beginning, as paper passes through the machine, it is wetted with a solvent using a felt wick and then pressed up against the master sheet. And the solvent causes some of the dye in the wax to dissolve and come off onto the sheet, producing a copy. So traditionally, the solvent was simply methanol or methylated spirits, ethanol with methanol added to make it undrinkable. But in 1938, an inventor named Johann Bjorkstein invented a non-flammable solvent for use in electrically driven machines, which was composed of 10% trichlorofluoromethane, 40% methanol, 40% ethanol, 5% water, and 5% ethylene glycol. Now, both of these solvents had an appealingly sweet aroma, and the older members of my audience are probably having major flashbacks right now to high school and immediately sniffing a freshly dittoed test or assignment as soon as it was handed out, just like this famous scene from Fast Times at Ridgemont High. And now I will give you a couple of moments to recover from that nostalgia trip. All good? All right, let's keep going. So unfortunately, while this unit does have its wick, it is missing its solvent tank. Thankfully, however, I was able to whip up a small replacement out of some plastic sheeting, which slots right in and should provide enough fluid flow for a demonstration of the unit. Now, finally, we need to load our paper in the back, and we have some paper guides here that we can adjust depending on the paper size. In this case, just regular 8.5 by 11. And to load the paper, you turn the top knob from off up to this symbol, which raises up the feed arm. You can put in your paper, then drop the feed arm back down by turning the knob to A. And finally, you set the lower knob according to the number of copies you wish to produce. And this adjusts the pressure on the rollers and accounts for the fact that when you're producing more copies, there's going to be less and less dye left on the master after a certain while. So you need more pressure to get the dye onto the page. And the instructions inside the lid give suggested settings for different sizes of print runs. Setting 1 for the first 200 copies, setting 2 for 200 copies and above, setting 3 for 250 copies and above, and setting 4 for 300 copies and above. And now you are ready to print, which you simply do by turning the crank handle clockwise. And while this copy is fairly faint, something I attribute to a lack of proper solvent flow inside the machine, this still gives you a good idea of the types of copies that these machines would produce. And with good quality materials, this could produce up to about 200 to 300 copies before the wax was depleted and the copies became too faint to be useful. Now, a couple more details to point out on this machine include this copy counter at the back, which can be reset by turning this knob, and this registration control on the drum, which controls how high or low on each sheet the image is printed. And all this does is adjust the drum starting position relative to the action of the feed arm. And if we take off this side panel here, we can see some of the mechanics inside the machine, including the cam and follower system attached to the drum that drives the paper feed arm. We can also see how rotating the upper knob raises, lowers, and locks the paper feed arm. And if I turn the lower knob to off, this will engage a cutoff valve in the missing solvent tank. And this prevents the solvent from evaporating via the wick when the machine is not in use. Now, just as with mimeographs, there are many variations on the same basic design. For example, some spirit duplicators use rollers instead of a felt wick to moisten the paper, while other duplicators didn't have integral solvent tanks, but rather fed from an external bottle or can. And of course, many later models were electrically driven. There are also many variations on the master sheets used in Spirit duplicators outside of simply coming in different colors. For example, the A.B. Ditt Company of Chicago, which originated the word mimeograph, developed a latent image master sheet, which was basically a form of invisible ink. It went on invisible, but could be revealed using a special felt tip developer pen. And this was marketed for use in schools, where the idea was you could give kids a test where they could reveal the answer at the end and grade themselves. The A.B. Ditt Company also came up with a technology called the azograph, in which both the master sheet and the solvent were initially colorless, but reacted when combined to produce a colored dye. And the idea was to limit the amount of staining to the operator's skin and clothes while using the machine. Now, due to their low cost of operation, Spirit duplicators were very popular with schools, churches, political organizations, fan clubs, and other small organizations that needed to run off a small number of copies very cheaply. And probably even more than the mimeograph, these machines were responsible for the rise of cheaply produced fanzines and fan culture in general. Anyway, that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time on another video where I'll look at yet more copying technology and other fascinating devices just like this one. Until then, I'm Jean Messier from Our Own Devices. Have a great day.